Hi guys, you have been asking me to do this for so long and now here I am. I am here. This video is an introduction to a new series that I'm going to be starting on fairy tales. You guys know that I'm obsessed with fairy tales. They influence a lot of what I write. I've made countless videos about fairy tales before, which I'll link in the description box down below. I've done bookshelf tours, I've done fairy tale hauls, I've talked about fairy tale retellings, but this is a new series that I want to start where I make bite-sized videos with lots of information in them that you can easily digest and learn little things about fairy tales that perhaps you didn't know before. And this has been sparked from many different things. I've been to see things like the Grimm's fairy tales in this old warehouse where they were acting out fairy tales and children there were quite scared and their parents were like, this is not really for children. I've been to see Matthew Bourne's Sleeping Beauty and have the person sit next to me going, well, this is very dark. And I think that we often forget the origin of fairy tales. Now, the origin of fairy tales is obviously lost somewhere along the way because they generally come from oral tradition and they are adapted and retold and then put down on paper after many people have added to the story. Jack Zipes, who is the fairy tale expert, along with Kate Bernheimer, I think of them as like the king and the queen of fairy tales. He likes to think of fairy tales as actual organisms, as things that evolve over time, and I think that's a really good way of looking at them. I'm going to be flashing up quite a few books to give you a feel of what we're going to be looking at over the next coming months and years as we go on this journey together. But if you're impatient and would like to know more about the books that I quickly flash in front of your eyes, then they will all be linked in the description so you can go and find them there. In this series, I want to look at the original tales of the Brothers Grimm and Charles Perrault and lots of other of the very famous people that we think of when we think about fairy tales. But I also want to discuss the lesser known writers and collectors of tales that are still being discovered these days. We're still discovering collections of fairy tales that we've never heard of before, and that's really exciting. And some of the new ones that have recently been discovered are Franz Xavier von Schomwerth, The Turnip Princess, and other stories. And then we've got Tales of the Marvellous and News of the Strange, which is a collection of Arabic fairy tales which was discovered a few years ago. I want to discuss the history and theory of fairy tale. As I said, Jack Zipes is the king. And I also want to look at people like Sarah Maitland, who have travelled around forests and stayed in them and researched those forest specific fairy tales, which I think is really cool. I want to talk about literary journals that analyse, discuss and make up new fairy tales. I want to talk about fairy tales from around the world. I want to talk about female voices and how those made their way into fairy tales in different ways, especially in the court and during the Renaissance period. And I want to talk about class in fairy tales too, because that is a really interesting discussion. I want to look at other with regard to fairy tales, so again touching on class but also race and also deformity. I've got these books that I'll be exploring soon and then discussing with you. I've got disability, deformity and disease in the Grimm's fairy tale, and I've also got this one which is The Other Within, the genius of deformity in myth, culture and psyche. I want to talk about the Enlightenment and science and how that really affected children's fiction and fairy tales. I want to talk about whether fairy tales are actually for children and who they were written for to begin with, because that's not always an easy thing to decipher. And as well as looking at the fairy tales that we know and love and think about with regard to Disney, perhaps not the gruesome roots, I also want to look at the lesser known ones and the writers today who are still experimenting with fairy tale tropes to retell the ones that we think that we know or to create entirely new ones. So I want to look at people like Helena Yayemi, I want to talk about Chigozie Obioma, I want to look at some poetry, short stories and graphic novels. Storytelling is such an important part of who we are, and I think fairy tales, more than most other kinds of stories, are social commentaries, are things that have been passed down, have been altered, have been tamed or untamed, and there are so many hidden doors and secrets to explore behind the history of the tale as well as within the tale themselves. The first proper video in the series that I'm doing will be going up next week, and it's a history of Sleeping Beauty, looking at how it's evolved over time. Quite a lot of you guys have been very sweetly asking recently if I'm going to be starting up a Patreon page. Patreon is a platform where you can kind of tip creators for what they're doing, but I have no plans to set up a Patreon page, though I do support so many fantastic creators through there, musicians, illustrators and YouTubers, so I think it's definitely an absolutely brilliant platform, but I don't have a plan to set up my own page. If you guys would like to support what I'm doing, you can always support me by buying the books that I've written, which are always linked in the description. You can download a podcast that I've put up, or you can simply share the content that I'm making, which is very much appreciated. I hope that you guys are excited for this new series. Let me know in the comment section down below. My normal content will continue as usual. This is just something else that I'm shoehorning in there. I hope you guys are having a great week. I will see you tomorrow for a discussion on Jane Eyre. Lots of bookish love. Bye.